Hello everyone, welcome to week 8. Can you believe it? I hope you've enjoyed the last couple of weeks focusing on working with children with Gillian and with Trent in my place. And you picked up some new skills, maybe a new interest in working with children. This week we're talking about self-disclosure and gentle confrontations. It also says ethics in the unit outline, but we're going to be covering that next week with case conceptualization. So I shall just share my screen, and here we go. Self-disclosure and gentle confrontation. So these are two areas that can be used in counselling to great effect. They can be really, really helpful and useful, but they can also go horribly wrong. So we need to think really carefully about why we use self-disclosure and confrontation and where it might be appropriate. So just to start with a little phrase that I like to use, I like to remember when thinking about self-disclosure. Use self-disclosure like salt, to add flavour but not to be the full meal. So when we're talking about self-disclosure, we don't want to disclose too much. And that should be one of the guiding principles when you're thinking about self-disclosure. When we're talking about self-disclosure, we're talking about therapist disclosure. So we're not talking about disclosure of the client. We're talking about you talking about something in your life or some experience or some feeling that you have of your own and sharing that with the client. So there are two kinds of self-disclosure. The first one is content self-disclosure. And that's where you're sharing something about your life or something that you've been through, some information about you. And, you know, to an extent, just by your body language and the way you respond to a client and the eye contact and, you know, whether you smile or not, and all those kinds of gestures that you make in the room, that's disclosing something to the client about who you are and what kind of person you are and what affects you and you know, things like that. Whereas here we're talking about direct self-disclosure, so where you're actually telling them some specific information about yourself. And then process self-disclosure is when we're talking about something that's happening in the room between yourself and the client. And again, that's a really useful tool to use, but it's got to be used correctly and sensitively. So content self-disclosure needs to be a deliberate and conscious choice by the counsellor. So it's not something that, you know, you're listening to a client story and they're telling you about some issues they're having and you're like, oh yeah, I've been through the same thing and, you know, I found it really challenging and, you know, what I did is this. It's not about that. It's not about just relating to something the client's saying and sharing it as a result. And, you know, that's one of the differences between being a counsellor and, you know, listening as a friend. Listening as a friend, you can quite often feel compelled to share your own experiences. And certainly a lot of you have found in the practice sessions, you have felt that urge to share similar experiences that you've been through. I know a lot of you have struggled with that because a lot of you have similar experiences right now, being, you know, post-grad students going through similar challenges in relation to that. So if it feels like you have an urge to share, then generally you shouldn't share that. So instead, content self-disclosure needs to be a deliberate choice because you think it could be helpful for the client. Now, so the counsellor shares an aspect of their own life experience, but it needs to be brief. It needs to be not full of all the, you know, the wonderful and weird details. It just needs to be as brief as possible to get the message across. The aim of using self-disclosure should be about enhancing the therapeutic alliance. It should be about communicating something to the client. And that could be about that they're not going to be judged here because, you know, maybe you've been through something similar. And certainly when you look at alcohol and drug services, people who have had experience of addictions before will often share that with their clients because that communicates that you're not going to be judged here. You know, I kind of get where you're coming from here. It can also be used to model self-compassion. So if you're sharing a time when you made a mistake, for example, or you struggled with something, it can show that you have that self-compassion, not to beat yourself up about it, or how you kind of grappled with that mistake. It can model hope, hope that things get better. It can normalize things. So, you know, often clients can really be very hard on themselves for thinking or feeling in certain ways or even acting in certain ways. So, you know, just sharing a very brief disclosure about, you know, a time when you felt the same way, or even I imagine if I was in that situation, I would feel the same. And that, you know, is an element of self-disclosure as well. So you can see that, you know, whether you're trying to model self-compassion or hope or normalize or communicate to the client that you're non-judgmental, that you're accepting of their situation, they're all decisions we're making, and they're conscious decisions rather than just feeling like we want to share something. It can be useful to end a content self-disclosure with a tentative question. So we can share a little bit of information about ourselves and then end it with, I'm not sure if that's kind of helpful in your situation or if that's similar to what you might be feeling. So just to reiterate to the client that we know that what we're feeling or what we went through isn't necessarily the same as what they're going through. So we can't assume that our experience is the same as theirs, and we need to communicate that in some way. So there's quite a bit of research on self-disclosure, and you can have a look on the database on self-disclosure. It's really interesting. But so some research suggests that self-disclosure can be really useful. It can help clients see you as more accessible, more down to earth, more human. And so they can feel more comfortable with you and sharing parts of themselves with you that they may feel some shame around. Whereas other research can suggest that over-disclosing can frighten clients. They can make them, it seem like you're less well-adjusted, and that might sound judgmental on the client's behalf. But we need to remember that quite often clients are already stigmatizing themselves for struggling with certain things, and so people who stigmatize themselves are more likely to stigmatize other people as well. And so if they're rejecting themselves, then they might reject you too. So we need to give our self-disclosures in a way that doesn't threaten a client's faith that you'll be able to help them. And so you can see it's a really delicate balance. So it can be also seen as helpful and honest. What other issues can you see with self-disclosure? Well, one of the other issues is that clients are there for help to offload, for relief of their distress. And so sometimes when we share our own situations, our own struggles, the balance can shift where the client feels like they need to take care of you. And this particularly is evident with clients who tend to be other focused, who tend to feel like they always need to be there for other people. And so that very delicate balance can shift towards them feeling like they need to ask more questions about you and attend more to how you're feeling, rather than it becoming, staying their space and their place to focus on themselves. So, questions to ask yourself when you have that the thought that a self-disclosure might be useful. Why am I disclosing this? So, is it because I relate? It's because I feel like, oh yeah, I really just got through that and I just want to share it. Or is it because it might be helpful for the client to know that they're not alone in their struggle? Does this client struggle with intimacy? And if so, is this disclosure making it more difficult for them to be in the room? So we need to be aware that some clients really struggle with being close to people, and by self-disclosing too much or too soon, we can really make it very difficult for them, and it can be very overwhelming for them to deal with that kind of disclosure. So we want to be a safe place for clients. So we want to go where they're at. So if we're disclosing before there's that level of trust and openness and intimacy between you, then we're making it very difficult for them to be in the room, which is the opposite of what we're intending. Is this for me or for the client? So I know I've said this a few times now, but we need to be constantly asking ourselves, am I doing this for myself or for the client? Does it feel good for me or will it be helpful for the client? And another question, will this accidentally communicate to the client? Well, if I can do it, so can you. So we don't want to be communicating to the client that because we managed to get through a particular situation or solve a problem, that they should be able to do it as well, because everybody's context is different, and everybody's resources are different. So we need to make sure that the message we're giving is one of hope rather than one of pressure. So, some general guidelines with using self-disclosure. If it feels good, don't do it. Okay? So if you forget about everything else that I've said in this lecture, just remember that one. If it feels good, don't do it. Only disclose what's necessary to help with the client's goals. So keep it minimal, exclude all the details, and watch very carefully for subtle signs of the client's eyes glazing over or just being a bit uncomfortable, and stop it at that point or before, which would be better. Make sure the timing works. So if a client's really doing a lot of focusing on their process and their they're getting some great insights into themselves, that time is not a good time for self-disclosure. So pick your time. You don't need to use self-disclosure in every session. And if you are using it in every session, I would say that's too much. On that point, self-disclosure should be rare and helpful, not a regular occurrence. And you may find, you certainly hear stories of counsellors who talk about themselves every session, and that's not a good sign, because the balance is shifting about the client being there for the counsellor rather than the other way around. Be sensitive to the fact that sharing about yourself can burden the client, so they can feel your pain. They can feel like they need to be there for you. They can feel guilty for using up the space for themselves. And remember, for some clients, no self-disclosure will be warranted, whereas for others, it will have a huge impact. So some clients want to know nothing about you. I've some clients I've seen for years and they know nothing about me and they have no interest other than, you know, the fact that of what matters to our therapeutic relationship. Whereas others, you know, it can have a big impact, you know, getting these little, you know, small nuggets of self-disclosure can have a big impact in how they see themselves and how they see you and how they see the world as well. Okay. So here is an example of a good self-disclosure. So Tim's having a very turbulent adolescence, has got into trouble, and as a result, his relationship with his parents is strained. Now, the counsellor has been through a similar thing and was expelled, and you know, had to move towns because it was a huge disgrace in that town. So instead of including all those details, the counsellor said, in high school, I was expelled. I thought it was the end of the world. My parents took it as the ultimate disgrace. So you can see there that there's a few things communicated. One of them is that this counsellor has been through a major adversity and survived and flourished. It instills hope. With that phrase, I thought it was the end of the world. It instills hope that that while it feels like you'll never get past this, you know, I felt that way too. And my parents took it as the ultimate disgrace. Can be an opportunity to reduce some shame around that and some despair. So I think that's quite a good use of self-disclosure there. So Mary is feeling overwhelmed in her new postgrad course and depressed by how much work she has to do. I'm sure none of you can relate to that. So the counsellor, listening to you brings me right back to my own days in uni. I don't think I was ever busier in my life. I also believe that the most depressing moments of my life occurred then. On any number of occasions, I wanted to throw in the towel. I remember once towards the end of third year. So you can get the sense pretty quickly that that's too much. That it's, you know, it's too much information and it's not all that helpful. I think if you stayed with the phrase of, I don't think I was ever busier in my life whilst doing my postgrad study, that could have been helpful. Just to relate, yeah, postgrad study is hard. So then we move over to process self-disclosure. And this is also called immediacy. And it's where a therapist will share something that's happening in the moment, in the room with the client. And it can be useful for a number of reasons. One of them is that it helps the client see the effect they have on the counsellor. So how something they're saying or how they're appearing can make the counsellor feel. It can help model ways of addressing interpersonal issues in the moment. And it can give clients an experience, a healthy experience of working out issues in the moment in a helpful way that actually makes things better, so they can get experience of that. And yeah, so kind of offers a space to rehearse communicating. So you would use process self-disclosure when the session is going nowhere. So maybe a client keeps changing the subject when you ask a particular question or you probe a particular area. Maybe there's making lots of excuses, or maybe there's a discrepancy between what they're saying and what they're looking like. When you feel like there's some tension between the client and the counsellor, and you feel like, I feel like I've done something wrong here, I'm not quite sure what that is. Process self-disclosure can be really useful there. when trust is an issue. So when you feel like the client isn't trusting you, or maybe they're testing you a little bit. And also when you feel like the client is trying to please you. So sometimes you get a sense that the client is coming in telling you that, you know, they're doing great, they're going for an hour's walk every day, they're communicating really well with their family, and you just get a sense that something's a bit off, that they're really just trying to come back and say, you've helped me, and you know, I'm doing everything really well now. When obviously, you know, that's not all that helpful for the client. So they want to address that with a really gentle process self-disclosure. Here are some examples of process self-disclosures. I'd like to stop for a moment and take a look at what's happening between us. Our session started out quite lively, but now it seems a bit subdued. And I'm feeling a bit tense as well. Sometimes I tense up when I think I've said something wrong. Do you think there might be any truth to that? So that's really a gentle way of saying, have I upset you, or is something going on between us? And unless you would address that, it's very difficult to move on in that session. So it is quite important to be able to address things that are happening in the room, as scary as that might seem. Another one, as you're talking, I notice I feel a great sadness, even though your voice has no emotion. I wonder if this sadness that I'm feeling is telling me something about how you're feeling right now. So sometimes we can, you'll notice that you are feeling something quite strongly, and you can use that as a tool, I suppose, to give you some indication of what might be going on in the client. And so, you know, sometimes I will use that particular self-disclosure around how I'm feeling to help a client access how they're feeling. So sometimes a client finds it quite difficult to access their emotion. So sometimes I'll use my own in a very minute way to help them access that. I notice that in our sessions, I get the feeling you're being really careful, like you're choosing your words carefully and maybe saying things you think I might want to hear. Now, this addresses that issue I mentioned before of the client trying to please you. And it's really great if you can address it at a point in time when you've developed a bit of a relationship. So you don't want to do it in the first session, that's for sure. And it's kind of giving permission, really, to the client to say, look, you don't have to be so careful with me. And the final one, you know, sometimes there's, you know, cultural barriers or differences that are kind of getting in the way. And sometimes it's just best to name those and to talk it over with the client and ask them, you know, what's working for you? You know, am I kind of going about this, you know, the right way, or is there anything that you want to change about our communication? Or is there anything you need to tell me, for example, as an Indigenous male, that would help me understand where you're coming from? Okay, so confrontation. This usually strikes fear in the heart of most trainee counsellors because it sounds scary, but it's really about helping clients live more according to their values. So it's not about saying you need to change, you need to wake up to yourself, or any of that kind of stuff. You know, like in the old form of motivational interviewing where confrontation was used to really shake people up and see the error of their ways and that kind of thing. Confrontation in a person-centered framework is really about helping people see, are they living according to how they want to be living, their values and their hopes and dreams for their lives. But the key is to do it in a gentle way. So on Blackboard, there's a video for you to have a look at. There's an example of a very bad confrontation and an example of a not so bad one. So have a look at that. So confrontation is a micro skill that's used to raise the level of awareness of the person seeking help about something that may be unacceptable to them. So something they're avoiding, but might be helpful looking at. So it might be because they're avoiding it. Drawing attention to it might be kind of seen as a challenge. So it needs to be presented in a really sensitive and acceptable way. So when might we use confrontation? Well, first of all, when someone is avoiding talking about something. So when it becomes, I mean, that's not to say that we decide what people need to be worried about. That's not what I mean there. I mean that if people are actively avoiding talking about something that seems to be causing them some distress, then we can use some gentle confrontation about that. So it's really important when we're talking about confrontation is that we're not using confrontation to meet our own biases and assumptions about how someone should be or what they should care about. Really, we need to stay with the client's frame of reference and their values, and use confrontation to help the client get closer to those values and goals in their life. We can use confrontation when a client is failing to recognise serious consequences. So if their everyday actions now have, quite serious consequences in the future. If they're making contradictory statements, that's not to say that we need to pick on every contradictory statement, because we all make contradictory statements at times. Locked into the past rather than the present. So someone who's really focused on going over things that have happened to them in the past, or the things people have done to them in the past, and have trouble looking at the present or the future. And so really, using a gentle confrontation can help the client think about, what am I losing by focusing on now? What am I scared about? And using incongruent verbal and non-verbal behaviour. So if they're talking about something that's really traumatic or sad and there's just nothing coming across. So some general guidelines when we're using this skill is make sure you've developed a relationship with the client first. So the first time you meet with the client, or even the second time, is not the time to use confrontation. So we need to make sure we've developed a relationship and that they're feeling, quite safe with you. Make an effort to see where they're coming from before you confront. So try and understand the problem that they're talking about, or that you're seeing, with empathy, and trying to understand what's underneath the behaviour before we confront. So try and see the problem through the client's eyes. Work on yourself. So in order for a gentle confrontation to ring true, we need to be the kind of people that work on ourselves and that are honest and that are open, and that accept our own failings and can admit our own failings and all those kinds of things. So we need to kind of embody the kind of person that clients would be willing to accept challenges from. So it's not about being a perfect therapist. It's about being someone who's constantly working on themselves and open and flexible, and willing to embrace their weaknesses. Be gentle, confront with hunches and suggestions rather than accusations. So that kind of tentative language, again, is really useful when we're doing confrontations. And it will make the the confrontation a lot easier to hear for the client, and therefore much more likely to be taken on board. Focus more on challenging strengths that aren't being used or values that are not being recognised in people's lives, rather than on client weaknesses for obvious reasons. We want to be working on empowering the client rather than pointing out weaknesses. Make sure your confrontations are in line with the client's values. So that goes back to me just saying before about making sure that we're not using confrontation to bring a client closer to what we feel they should care about or how we think they should behave. Really, we need to be in line with their values. And be aware of your own reluctance to challenge. So some trainee counsellors are really reluctant to challenge, and that's great. It's a great opportunity to really do some processing, write about it in your journal about what is it about challenging that I find so uncomfortable. Is it because I need people to like me, or I'm afraid they're going to be angry at me, or whatever it might be. So be aware of that, because being reluctant to address the tough stuff in a session can mean that you are less effective than you want to be. So you can just kind of skate along the surface, and when everything's good, everything's good. But at some point, when you're working with a client, things need to be addressed. And so be aware of any reluctance or any fear of confrontation or challenge, and have a think about that, process it, write about it, bring it up in group, all of those things. So there's a few different ways we can use confrontation. The first one is a you but statement. So you say that you believe in honesty, but you seem to be hiding a serious matter from your wife. So this is quite a in-your-face confrontation, and you need to make sure that you've got that relationship with the client in order to use that. Gently ask the client to discuss the discrepancy. Help me understand how, on the one hand, you say you're honest, and on the other hand, you're hiding the affair from your wife. So you're asking the client to explain to you how they cope with something. Reframing. Even though honesty is important to you, sometimes other values take priority. In this case, your fear of the marriage ending seems to be more important than being honest. And I think that's a really useful way of confronting. So you're saying that, you value honesty, but you're really afraid to be honest because you don't want your marriage to end. And using empathy. You must be feeling quite conflicted. On the one hand, you value honesty, and on the other hand, you're hiding an affair. It sounds like there's more to this story for you. So if in doubt, use empathy, because it will get received more easily, and it communicates those person-centered values that we want to communicate. And it will likely, hopefully, lead to more exploration with the client. So when you notice there's inconsistency between what someone's saying and how they look, or how they're communicating, on the one hand, you're saying you're all right, and on the other, I catch some pain or sadness in your voice. So again, that's bringing it into the room of what's going on. It can really give the client permission to notice how they're feeling and to share it. Inconsistency in words and actions. So you say that your kids are the most important thing in the world to you, but you seem to rarely go see them. So you can ask a question following that. So, can you tell me more about that? It can really highlight the difference between, words and what they're saying they value and their actions. Another one could be you say that you want to work less or have a better work-life balance, but you seem to keep taking on work projects. What do you think's going on there? Inconsistency between statements and evidence. You say you're no good with people, yet you seem to have some very good friends. So and that helps the client see maybe there is some assumptions that aren't necessarily played out in reality here. So they're making some assumptions about themselves that aren't true. You say that your boyfriend treats you like a princess, but the way you describe his behaviour lately sounds like it would make you feel awful. Sometimes the client feels that they need to present a certain picture of their family or of their partner, but there's certain behaviours that they describe that would consider, that kind of disputes the way they've described their family or their partner. So this is just a way of kind of probing that a little bit and highlighting that. So you say this, but this kind of suggests that doesn't feel so good for you. So that's the end of the presentation on confrontation and self-disclosure. So in our tutorials, we are going to be practicing all the skills up until now in preparation for your skills videos. So, so we're going to be using your active listening, your questions, your empathy, and your paraphrasing. But this time we're going to be looking for opportunities to practice some self-disclosure as well. And some opportunities to try some gentle confrontation as well. So if you can't find any opportunity to use one or the other, then that's okay. But try and keep an open mind to, I wonder if, I could use a gentle confrontation here. Even if it's just picking out, a difference between what they're saying and, an emotion you're picking up. So see how you go with that. We're also going to do some, just a little discussion around self-disclosure and your thoughts around that. But have a great week and enjoy your practice.